The discussion today is in India, Japan, and the global south. Perhaps you've all followed Prime Minister Kishida's recent visit here, and so focus on, of course, when he announced a new FOIP, the new free and open Indo-Pacific policy, there was particular mention of the global south. You know, we as we're respective chairs of the G7 and G20, and India also, there's been been giving a lot of primacy to the importance of the global south. So I have a very eminent panel. What I'm going to do is just introduce them and then say a few points about the subject, and then we would have our panelists speaking about various aspects of it. They'd speak for about 10 to 12 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for comments and questions. I would request them to, of course, comment on each other's, also their interventions. And then if there's time, we could perhaps take a last round of some comments also. But I'm sure, looking at all of you, that we're going to have a lot of questions today. So I start with Dr. C. Rajamohan. He's a senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute, Delhi. As we know, is a leading foreign policy analyst, academic, journalist. All of us, of course, know him, who has a number of books and other publications to his credit. He's worked as director of the Institute of South Asia Studies at NSU in Singapore till recently, till about a year ago. He was founding director of the Carnegie India, and is associated with leading think tanks, ORF, CPR, various universities. Again, an author of many books, and I think the most recent one is the New Asian Geopolitics, Military Power and Regional Order. So we look forward to hear from Dr. Rajamohan on the subject. Our other panelist is Dr. Sanjaya Baru. Again, a very well-known political commentator, economist. I mean, he's both a political commentator and he writes on economic issues. He writes a lot on, I think, contemporary Indian politics and economics, and I'm once quite amazed about how prolific he is in the number of books which have, he's been able to bring out. He's a well-known columnist, but he's also had various other positions. He was media advisor to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. He was Secretary General of FICCI. He was also, as a journalist, associate editor of the Times of India, the Economic Times, and the chief editor of Business Standard. He has a close association with Japan. I have also known him when I was there in Japan as ambassador. And interestingly, recently he has edited a book on the importance of Shinzo Abe after Shinzo Abe's assassination, Japan and India and the Indo-Pacific, which we look forward to, should be released sometime soon. I come last to my former colleague and friend, Dr. Mohan Kumar, Professor Mohan Kumar. He's a professor of diplomatic practice and Dean, Office of International Affairs and Global Initiatives of O.P. Jindal Global University. Former diplomat, he was ambassador, he retired as ambassador to France and Monaco, as I saw in his CV, because somebody mentioned the Marshall Islands. All of us do more than one. We have a concurrent accreditation. So I think I should mention Monaco too. But he's known among us, among his colleagues, as kind of, really somebody who got a lot of expertise in global trade and WTO negotiations, and we highly respected for his knowledge. And he's also authored a book on the negotiations and dynamics of the WTO, if I've got it right. So he's a blogger, vlogger, commentator, many things. And Mohan, we look forward to hearing from you. So now on the subject itself, I thought I'd just make a few points. So today it's India, Japan, and the global south. So I thought I'd start off with something on the origin of the global south. So the global south is something we certainly, in practicing diplomats, lived with. So initially you had something, the nomenclature of the third world that was used for developing countries, and it came with certain associations, certain kind of judgments, poor, not very democratic, colonial histories, blah blah, all of that. And then I think quite deliberately there was a move from there to talk more in terms from third world to talking about developing, developed, and then so on, and then this global south which emerged. Now, as far as the global south is concerned, and we had various things. If you remember, we had the South Commission, I think it was called. In the course of our lives, we worked a lot among so-called the South to work together. In the North-South engagement was always one mainly of ODA when you talked about the North-South engagement. There have been changes in what we call the Global South, and what one would say is the Global South now is no longer what it was maybe 30, 40 years ago, certainly. And now you're looking at a group of countries in the Global South. Of course, geographically, perhaps know what it is. I mean, Latin America, Africa, Asia, Oceania, that's where the Global South more or less is. But you're looking at countries that are industrializing, are industrialized. So, it's not only in terms of, sort of low levels of development that you look at them. These are areas also now with potential for trade, markets. So there's a whole change in the way people are looking at the Global South. The other thing that I wanted to mention to you was, of course, India. As I said, we've been very involved with South-South cooperation, and now we have a very active DPA, that we have a development cooperation program with various countries, which is growing, and this is far more focused than it ever was before. So, which is why also I think in the context of the G20 that we've decided to bring the question of development back into the agenda. Well, yes, these countries have progressed, but there's still issues, and a lot of issues which have been thrown up by the war recently, for example, food security, energy issues, climate change issues, and we don't want that to be lost focus of. India also has its own issues such as terrorism and so on, and we believe that we should be able to look at that in the context of the G20. Now, when you come to Japan, it's very interesting because, Japan, right from the time, soon after the war, and they were really battered, in the Second World War, but as early as 1950, they came out with a policy on aid, on global aid. I think initially the focus was perhaps more the Asia-Pacific. Because of the experience of the war, perhaps they wanted to win friends back. Perhaps that was the reason. In about 1954, they joined the Colombo Plan. Thereafter, there was some technical aid. But the first country, as we know, the narrative goes, the first country to have actually accepted aid or development cooperation assistance from Japan was India in 1958. So there was a lot of reluctance on part of Southeast Asian countries, and that was their focus area. Was actually as the Asia Pacific, as it was called. There was reluctance at that point of time because the history of war was very, very recent. So they started with India, and then this went on, became a very important pillar in a way of their foreign policy, and various reasons as to why this happened. I mean, one was because there was of course a post-war period, and then you have the period of economic prosperity. And I think as Japan comes into its own, it's looking at a much wider foreign policy, moving away from Asia, it's looking at other parts of the world, and and that continues till today. That wants to profile itself as a major player in world affairs. So you find this in two ways. One is, of course, the development cooperation assistance now spreads from Asia. So you find them now engaged with Latin America, with Africa, Oceania. So and even now with Central Asia. And I'll talk to you about some some structures that they have in place for that. So they've been very engaged in what they call a more panoramic visions, been part of their policy for various reasons. One is they've also, I think, for their political ends, they have found this very useful to use development assistance. More recently, I think they've also looked at it as a tool of really their own economic development, because when you're trying to export large infrastructure projects, even if it is by way of development cooperation by soft loans, what really happens is that you're able to be able to export these major Japanese infrastructure projects, which otherwise would not really be competitive if they had to go for international tenders. So there are various reasons as to why they are. Of course, the rise of China, and you find again, with the BRI, they came out with something of their own, which they called Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. Which was kind of a counter to BRI. They talk a lot about infrastructure and so on. So they have certain, they already have certain groupings which were formed. The first one, I think, was with Africa. It was called TCAD. And that was in the, I think in perhaps the early 90s, 93 or so. And then they went on to have something called PALM, which is Pacific Islands Leaders Meetings. So this is another geographical group that they were looking at. And they have something called C5+1, which was Central Asia. So what we see is that they're already very much engaged. The question here is, so why suddenly this focus? And I hope that the panelists will answer that. So why is this, they've already been engaged. It's not a discovery of the global south. So what is this discovery about now? So this really is what I should say. Kishida, as you know, has focused a lot, and I would really ask the panelists to talk about it. One last point is that to go back to where I started, the G7 and the G20, there is this feeling, since we both chairing these two groupings, that where are the convergences, and the very apparent convergences really to do with both of us focusing on the global south. So are there really convergences? And if there are convergences, what are they? How can it really play out in practical terms? And one more thing I think I'll ask them to talk about is personalities, and personalities here in the Prime Minister Kishida. Kishida comes after, Prime Minister Abe short period of Suga. But what is Kishida sending a message out? Where is he different from Abe? What is he looking at at the Global South engagement, which is different from the way it has been before? So these really are some of the points that I wanted to mention, and I will sort of now, I think, start off by asking Raj, if you will speak first. I just want to say that, since you have been speaking extensively, talking about Ukraine in particular, and global geopolitics of late, which is of course the kind of something that one can't ignore. How would you explain the emergence of Kishida as a new champion of the Global South? You wrote an article saying that. So, would you put that in context? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Wadhwa. Thank you for chairing this session and giving us really a good, background as well as the context in which we're going to talk about India, Japan, and the Global South. I think to start with what you asked about PM Kishida, he's really been a surprise in many ways. What he's achieved in the last year and a half has really been quite remarkable, because most people thought, he was really not there measuring up to Abe-san's kind of big shoes. And he was also seen as someone coming from a very, peace constituency, the Hiroshima, and that he would be soft, he would not be able to push the strategic envelope. But over the last 1 year, I think we've seen Japan actually talk about doubling the defense expenditure. There's a whole new national security strategy document that was issued late last year. He's talking about a counter-strike capability. That means building a large missile arsenal in Japan that can deal with the challenges from China, North Korea, and Russia. And then taking the leadership role in some ways on the Ukraine question within Asia. Because if you look at Asia, barring Singapore, nobody else, not talking about Australia, who really in the ASEAN and other places really implemented the sanctions. So in some ways, he's really led the charge of saying why Ukraine could be the future of Asia if we don't respond to it. So I think, given the fact that a nuclear weapon power can, occupy another country, because there are clear parallels here, not only to Taiwan, because China-Japan dispute on the East China Sea, India-China dispute in the Himalayas. So the issue. So I think he's framed it in such a bold manner. Few thought actually any Japanese Prime Minister will do this, because Prime Minister Abe tried very hard for a long time to revamp Japan's security policies, but he really couldn't fully succeed. But I think within the last year, certainly after Ukraine, there's been a dramatic transformation, and Kishida has led it. What I thought I'll do is really 5 broad points on the geopolitics of it. First, I think Japan has been really an underestimated power. For a long time, Japan was seen as a follower of the United States. That maybe once in a while, post-90s, checkbook diplomacy. Americans say, look what the hell have we done? They'll go around with a checkbook and say, give aid to others. To one of actually, in the last decade and a half, it's really Japan that has demonstrated great intellectual leadership, which is completely new, because Japan was a pacifist power. For example, the idea of Indo-Pacific was completely a construct of the Japanese. When India, US, and Australia were all skeptical, it's really Japan that persisted and developed the idea of the Indo-Pacific. Today, it's become part of our lexicon, but 10 years ago, it was not. The idea of the Quad, again, if you go back to Abe's speech in the Indian Parliament, both the idea of Indo-Pacific and the Quad, we talked about 2007, where he actually lays out both these ideas, and they systematically promoted the concepts, despite the skepticism all around. And now I see them again coming up with some new ideas. For example, on this whole question of infrastructure. Japanese don't have not run by a communist party, so their propaganda is not great. BRI comes off your mouth easily than PQI. I don't know how many of us can say PQI, a partnership for quality infrastructure, but I think they're coming up with initiatives. And now the new idea that they want to promote at the G7 is economic security. Idea that how do you deal with Chinese economic coercion, and I think that's a big thing. I think probably that will come out of the G7 meeting. In some senses, then Japan has become a leader from being a mere passive follower of the United States. The second, I think, on the global South issue, India and Japan are coming from opposite directions, or from the same set of problems like Ukraine. For Japan, which sees the need to respond to Ukraine crisis. Not just preparing Asia for a different attitude, but the arguing that the West should ask itself, why did so many countries of the developing world did not support the Western position on Ukraine? Therefore, in fact, what Kishida is saying is that, look, that we must ask this question, telling the G7 and the United States. We must understand the specific historical conditions in which these countries have come from, and that it's important to understand their evolution rather than giving them lectures on human rights. So I think that is something to say that within the G7, this is a very different argument than the dominant argument since the end of the Cold War, which is we'll tell the global South what to do, to one of actually engaging them with respect, with a sense of historical context. So I think that's a big change. And India is coming to the global South from the same Ukraine problem, that the concerns of the developing countries have not been addressed. Therefore, we're going to take it up. So therefore, we're coming into it from different directions. We wanting to say the Ukraine crisis, the Western focus has not really address the questions of food, fuel, and fertilizer security, and that their voices must be heard in the G20 summit. While what Japan is doing is that using the G7 to actually raise the long-term consequences of Ukraine and use the larger G7 platform to reach out to the global South and to address their concerns. The third, I think, is the context for this, of course, the larger context for this, that's my third point, which is really, there is a new contestation between the major powers. This is not happening in abstract. You have a war in Europe. You have China-US relationships are going down. So the relative harmony among the major powers that we had from 89, say, to 2010, 14, you can say Crimea, when Crimea was taken, that period is over. That you have China, Russia coming together, and the US rallying the West to stand up and fight against the Russians and the Chinese. So you have actually a real conflict between the major powers for the first time. And the second aspect of the current situation is there is the assumptions of globalization that we had for the last 30, 40 years. So those are being questioned. The notion that politics does not matter. It's all about everyone doing reform and everyone opening up their markets, and this would happily lead to perpetual peace. What the current argument is that you need to make significant adjustments to this. So you are in a different place. And this leads us to my fourth point, which is because there is rivalry. In fact, normally it is a common thing to say Cold War is bad for us. But actually, those of us who still remember the Cold War, actual Cold War, actually when the big powers are competing with each other, the leverage of the others actually goes up. Provided you are big enough, or you have the capability enough, or you have a location to actually play the one against the other. Because there is today a growing competition, not only for the hearts and minds of across the global South. If you own a lot of cobalt in your territory, or if you have rare earths in your territory, both China and the US will come to you. So I think it is really having a capability to make a difference to the larger dynamic gives leverages, and I think today the attempt to win the South is part and the consequence of the great power rivalry that has emerged, and I think that is the context in which Japan is talking about it, and I think there's no secret here. It is a direct contestation with China. where the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure was a response to BRI. But Japan has a longer experience of actually building infrastructure, long before China came into the game. All across the ADB, Japanese support for infrastructure development in China, in Southeast Asia was quite fundamental. So therefore, I think the Japanese are today looking, one is infrastructure, and looking beyond how do you deal with economic coercion, and therefore can we develop norms and others on economic coercion. My last point is, can India and Japan work together? Because on the face of it, our positions are very different. On Ukraine, they're fundamentally different. But I think if you place this in the context of our problems, shared problems with China, then you come to a different picture. So look, the G20 summit will be done in September, the G7 will be done in May. There's a world beyond that. That world is really of a deepening contestation. And for the first time in Asia, the number 3 economy, the number 4 economy have problems with the number 1 economy, which is China. That is, India and Japan have serious problems. Can they pool the resources to deal with this problem over the longer term? And I think that is the context in which we're trying in South Asia. We've done some cooperation on infrastructure. There was an attempt in Africa. I don't think that really worked. But I think today, given the scale of the challenge both of us face from China, that I think it is in the fundamental interest of us, beyond Ukraine, beyond what we say we vote for the resolution or not. There is, I think, if you look at it long term, the need to stand up to Chinese, BRI now today is being transformed into so-called global development initiative. There's going to be a global security initiative. There's going to be a global civilizational initiative. The Chinese, as I said, Chinese Communist Party is pretty good at this. So they're going to keep churning out this. But I think the onslaught of the Chinese offensive needs a response. And I think in Asia, a collaboration, partnership between India and Japan will be critical for that. The question is, can we overcome the current differences on Ukraine and build an agenda that actually allows us to respond to the Chinese challenge? I'll stop here, Mr. Wadhwa.
Thanks. Thanks, Raj. Very, very interesting and very valid points. There's one bit of that I took from you is about Kishida himself as the personality. So, is it that he's emerging as a big leader, or is it that he's trying to shore up his image because his own popularity domestically is actually not where it should be? It's pretty low, at an all-time low. So, is there some bit of that, and to get away from the image that you have of Kishida as a dove? So how much of it is that, and how much of it is real leadership qualities? How much is it trying to distance himself from the really huge shadow of Abe and find his own space? So I think that is something that Sanjay and Mohan perhaps could talk about. So I'll now go to Dr. Sanjaya Baru. Given again your own interest, you've written about so many things about geoeconomics. I thought I'll ask you to speak about geoeconomics, and I wanted to request you to speak on Japan's apparent rediscovery of the global South in terms of geoeconomics. So how do you see that?
Thank you, Deepa, and thank you, Raj, for inviting me. I think it's been a long time since I've been at the same table as Raj. I was recalling Carnegie. I think when you were here with Carnegie, we were together, so it's nice to be here at ASPE. Let me first respond to 3 of your questions, Deepa, and then I will move on to talk about what I had come prepared to talk about. There is some element of convergence in both. On your very first question, why Global South? I think we all have forgotten in the last year, because of this G20 circus, that the first time the G7, or at that time it was called the G8, reached out to the Global South was in 2003, when Prime Minister Vajpayee represented India. When the G8 met in France, and President Sarkozy took the initiative of bringing India, Brazil, South Africa, and a couple of other countries, probably Mexico. Since then, at every G7 summit till 2008, the G5 were invited. I had the opportunity of attending all those in 2004, 2008. It was after the global or the transatlantic financial crisis of 2008 that the G20 became a heads of government summit. And The G20 addressed a very major challenge to the global economy in 2008, 2009, up to 2010, which was the only 3 years, in my judgment, that they actually did anything useful. After which the G20 has become a basically non-existent, moribund organization. It has nothing to show from 2010 to 2022 for bringing 20 and more heads of government together every year. Therefore, moving from that question of why Global South to G7 and G20, I think the fact is that given what Raja has said about contestation of global powers, etc., the world is today in a flux in which the G7 desperately need the G20. I think India's abstention at the UN Security Council, and followed by Brazil and so many other countries, has woken up to the G7 that they have to pay some attention to these fellows. And therefore, this outreach, so-called outreach to the G20, to the Global South, is a consequence of this current geopolitical situation. Finally, on your specific question about Kishida and Abe, I'm not too enthused by Kishida's kind of image. Almost everything he has done, and I'll show, even looking at aid, which is what I'm going to talk about, he has built on Abe. The first Japanese, you are absolutely right, TCAD was launched in 1993, but nothing much was done in Africa till 2000 and 2006, 16, right? When
Asia Africa Growth Corridor was
2016, when Abe took TCAD out of Japan and went to Nairobi and convened the Tokyo. TCAD, incidentally, for those of you, I'm sorry for these short terms, is the Tokyo International Cooperation for African Development, the International Conference for African Development. So Abe was the author of TCAD. Abe is the author of this focus on the South. Abe is the author of the security paradigm on which Kishida is building. I mean, Kishida wouldn't have had the courage to do what he has done on defense and security, I'm afraid, if he didn't stand on the shoulders of Abe. So Abe is the man who is the architect of the new Japan, and Kishida is. So that answers your three questions the best way I can. But let me move on to what I was going to say in the 10 minutes left for me. I'll make 5 quick points. First, the primacy of the bilateral in Japan's aid policy, which the chairperson touched. Global South was not the focus. The focus of Japanese aid policy was individual countries. In fact, as an aside, let me take 30 seconds and say that I have been a strong advocate of bilateral relations with Japan. And honestly, I have written also, as you know, that this current fashion of looking at Japan through multiple prisms, trilateral, quadrilateral, multilateral, it has not helped in strengthening the bilateral. I think we are losing sight of the bilateral relationship if you look at the actual progress on the ground, talking about Japan, America, India, Quad with Australia, and Indo-Pacific, and Global South. These are all frameworks in which, in my judgment, Japan's interests and India's interests don't necessarily converge. There's some area of common interest, but fundamentally, I'm someone who has always emphasized, in whatever I've said or whatever capacity I've had an opportunity to emphasize, that unless we build the bilateral relationship, the other relationships will not have a life beyond that bilateral relationship. And the India-Japan bilateral relationship, in my judgment, is not strong enough. I don't believe it will withstand the pressures that are emanating in the world today, whether in the framework of the war in Ukraine or China or any other framework. But Japan's focus as far as development cooperation is concerned has been essentially bilateral. It's only Abe who incidentally brought in regional organizations. Even in TCAD, he brought in regional organizations and gave them a space within the Japan-Africa kind of aid relationship. Otherwise, as you correctly said, in the initial years, they were looking for friends. India was one of their early friends. But the minute Southeast Asia began accepting aid, you look at the numbers, it completely shifted ASEAN. ASEAN becomes the primary focus of Japanese aid and assistance, and the numbers are quite staggering. Till as recently as 2011-20 period, for which I have data, ASEAN dominates the Japanese aid program. India, of course, became number one only after, if I'm not mistaken, Yoshiro Mori's visit. Till then, China was the main recipient of Japanese aid. It's only after the post-nuclear test détente that India's shares started growing. Asia as a whole has a share of something like 80% in the total aid of Japan. So when you talk of Japan and Global South, the rest of the Global South is only 20%. Asia dominates, and Asia includes South Asia, Southeast Asia, and what the Japanese document calls MENA, which is Middle East and North Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the Pacific Islands and Eastern Europe, account for the other 20%. I'm saying all of this till 2020. I will come to the current situation very quickly. The focus on aid mainly is soft areas: agriculture, education, transportation, again with tide aid, etc., healthcare, and therefore developmental aid was essentially focused in developmental areas. Now let me move on to the second point, which is that the focus on the Global South as in general is really a response to China. It's really a response to China, and therefore very much within the framework of what you have already mentioned, that the growing Chinese presence in the region. But given Japan's track record, which is that essentially it is private sector-led development program, it is tide aid, promoting Japanese business interests, etc. There is a problem. How do you compete with China, which comes with its purse and opens its purse and is willing to transact business across the board? And I'll come back to this point when I talk about India and Japan. Now the change comes in 2020, which Raja has already mentioned, which is that in 2020 there was a new white paper on Japanese development cooperation, which was along with an official review of Japanese ODA done by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2022. And all of these assessments that were done came to the conclusion that Japan must now have a strategic focus. And that's the important shift going into Africa, going into outside or even within Asia, which is a traditional area. There's a shift, there's a clear strategic shift, which is again because of China. And for the first time, the Japanese are talking about military aid as part of their aid program. So this review suggests that the Japanese have a very clear national security perspective, national strategic perspective, within which they are looking at their engagement of the developing world beyond Asia. My own view, looking at the numbers, is that Eastern Europe and Latin America are not going to be that important. I think in both areas the Chinese are far ahead of Japan, and I don't see Japan being able to compete effectively. So going out of Asia, Japan will focus on on Africa. And that brings me to this final point, which is this whole theme of today's evening, which is India, Japan, and Africa, or global south, but essentially Africa. Can India and Japan work in Africa? I think that is really a fascinating question for me, given the fact that both countries, essentially their aid programs have a soft focus on education, health, and such areas. And given the fact that Japanese investment is tied to the promotion of Japanese business, is there a potential for Indian private sector, Japanese private sector, Indian institutions, Japanese institutions to actually do some work in Africa? And it to me at the moment it remains a question. There's no answer to this, because I have not seen a good assessment of Indian aid to Africa, nor in fact there is no, I tried to locate, there is very little assessment. The only articles that have appeared on Japanese aid to Africa repeatedly make the point that it all begins with Abe. It all begins with 2016. The TICAD, Nairobi is the starting point. And we are in 2022, just 4-5 years down the road. So given the lack of adequate documentation of what we have done on the ground, I think it's premature to speak about all of this as great potential for cooperation, unless, and I come back to my original point, unless we strengthen our bilateral relationship. It's only a stronger India-Japan relationship that will enable India and Japan to function in Africa. Because the objectives are similar but not necessarily parallel. Our historical equation with many African countries is different. Japan's experience in Africa is limited. China's influence in Africa is enormous. Given that, I'm not sure whether our respective governments and aid agencies are adequately equipped to work together in a continent in which their experience is relatively recent. I mean, India's is not recent, but limited. So I would in fact advocate beginning somewhere. For example, begin with Kenya. Take one country and see if actually Japan and India can do something together in Kenya, where that kind of success can then move around the continent. So let me end with the 4 questions that I have. Since there are a lot of students here, I thought I'd ask some questions which can be useful as research subjects. First, given the increasing important strategy of strategic objectives, and incidentally all these are mentioned in the white paper, so let me just read out an interesting poll that the Japanese conducted among their own, companies and academics, etc. It shows that 18% were in favor of giving strategic priority orientation to ODA. 10% emphasized the need for interministerial coordination. 8% emphasized the need for better monitoring and evaluation. 9% emphasized the improvement of sectoral focus. 2% emphasized the importance of global cooperation with the South. So strategic priority gets a large percentage support within that community that was interviewed for this white paper. Given that, my first question is, do our strategic objectives in the global South align? Our strategic objectives align to a large extent in the Indo-Pacific, which is why the Quad has come into being. But when we go into Africa, I'm not talking about the global South as a whole, but let's say Africa, which is an area of interest to us, importance to us. Do we have shared objectives? One. Second, what experience of bilateral cooperation in third countries do we have? Are we doing trilateral cooperation in, let's say, Nepal, India, Japan working together in Nepal, or India, Japan working together in Sri Lanka? We are not, to the best of my knowledge. So if we are not working in our neighborhood, can we together work in other countries? Is a question. Third question, since Japanese ODA is essentially private sector focused, what is the potential for Japanese and Indian companies to work together in third countries? And finally, Is Japan an asset for India and Africa or a liability? Let me stop with that.
Thank you. Thank you, Sanjay. Very interesting questions. I think I'm going to ask Mohan to look at a few of these questions, as really somebody is a practitioner and see what happens. There are a couple of interesting things that I wanted to just mention. That I think, the difference with the Japanese going into PQI and BRI, of course, it is in sort of a reaction to China, but the problem is the Japanese till now have followed the OECD model of norms. And this is a big thing. You see, even when they looked at PQI, it was all about setting norms. Everything that they come out with is this whole normative approach, which I think most of the so-called global South do not want. And that is the ease that they have dealing with China. So, these sort of, now that there seems to be new sensitivities that, Rajamohan spoke about, I think maybe one of the things that will come out of this is that Japan will give a new orientation to the way the G7 starts looking at engagement with the global South. That's the only hope that we can have from this. The other thing that I didn't want to mention is that, we should have worked together, Japan and India. We've been talking about it, and it's been in our joint statements for the longest time that we will work together in third geographies. I mean, honestly, I don't think much has come out of it. I see Titli's here. We can mention she works a lot on Japan and say, where it's worked and it hasn't. And Kenya was one of these cases where we tried to do something in the form of a small hospital or something which never took off. So as to why that isn't working. As far as the companies are concerned, very often I think Mohan will talk about it. I mean, can you force the private sector to do something? And that's something which is an issue. One change that I find from these statistics that you were talking about ODA in Japan, Sanjay, is that in the context of Ukraine, apparently, and not anything to do with ODA, but with their national security strategy and the changes that Kishida brought, which was quite far-ranging, they got far more public support than one would have got in the past for counterattack and things like that. And I think the reason for this was Ukraine, because somehow they have been able to convince the public or sell the narrative of the parallel between what has happened in Ukraine and what can happen in Japan. So I think this is some of the, I don't know whether that has changed perceptions. And thank you very much. And now, Dr. Mohan Kumar. So, you're Professor of Diplomatic Practice. And so as practitioners, I just wanted to ask how the convergence of interests of India and Japan, I think partly has been answered by both, or rather addressed by both Raj and by Sanjay. I mean, how will they play out? I mean, is there really space for these convergences? And if there are convergences, that is one thing in the concept, the limited context of our chairmanships, which will also end in a finite period. And then there's a period beyond that where can we work together? And if we can work together, where can we work together? Why hasn't it happened? And what do you think we should do more?
So thank you, Deepa. I want to thank Raj and ASPI for this opportunity, and it's great to be here. I'm not normally at a loss for words, but today I am. I've been preceded by three people, I think, who have covered a lot of ground. So I will definitely not speak for 10 minutes, but let me try and speak for as much as possible, and maybe just pick up on the points where I express my point of view. On Sanjay Garu, with due respect, on bilateral relations, I don't know what your ideal is, but it's vastly better than what it was before, isn't it? So I think one can grant that. Concretely on cooperation with Japan, I was fortunate to be involved in one, so I'll speak to that. I spent hours, literally hours on the Zoom, India, Japan, Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka was represented by a think tank, Japan was represented by JICA, but also some other think tank, and I at that time was chairman RAS, so I represented RAS. We coordinated hell of a lot when it comes to provision of aid. And this was much before the IMF stepped in. I'm talking of 1 year ago, or even 1.5 years ago. So I personally think there is tremendous scope for what I call triangular cooperation as opposed to trilateral, and I'm sure you guys know what triangular is. 2 developing countries and 1 developed country, in this case Japan, cooperating with India in third world countries. I think I think there are two ways in which we have done this, to the best of my recollection, but I should have done my homework as you did, Sanjaya Baru, which I haven't, for which I apologize, because there are a few projects in Bangladesh that we did, which I recall definitely, but two areas. One is this kind of coordination to help a country like Sri Lanka, and both India and Japan coordinated with vis-a-vis IMF. And we said we will push the case with IMF. At the time, Sri Lanka was extremely, what shall I say, not confident at all, diffident about getting support from China. Later on they did. So I think there is scope for that kind of cooperation. The second area where I remember as Joint Secretary doing something is, if China is going to invest something in Bangladesh, we request Japan to step in. And they have done that in the past. So the idea being that Japanese investment in the neighborhood is infinitely preferable to China. At least one or two cases they did. And we literally begged them. They said, listen, you have the money. And we also spoke to Sheikh Hasina and telling her that, listen, this could be an alternative. And we support that. So exactly triangular cooperation, I'm not able to give you specific projects. Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, to put it very bluntly, was a failure. I think the rhetoric far outstripped the actual performance. So that's a bit of a dampener. But I do see tremendous scope for this kind of coordination. Bilateral relationship could be better, I agree with you, but I think there is a certain comfort. I mean, I know that for Prime Minister Modi, there was no better friend than Abe. The only other person who came in later was Macron. But it's not the same at all. And I don't know if Kishida enjoys that kind of relationship, but you know that political relations are important. So I believe we can do things with Japan. That brings me to what we can do in the context of G20. I actually think this is the only partner from G7 with whom we can really talk in terms of getting a consensus document at the Delhi summit. I don't know what the chances are of a consensus document in the Delhi summit, but if there is one country in the G7 which understands where India is coming from, I dare say it is Japan. I don't think we can have the same conversation on United States, UK. Their views on Ukraine are so far out. So I don't think that's possible. I personally think we should have more conversations with Japan and give it a shot. And incidentally, on the global south itself, I got something from the MEA after digging, after pestering them. We have some inputs from the Voice of the Global South Summit on climate change. For example, the small island developing nations want 1.5 rather than 2%. They want better representation, more voice for themselves, including a reform of the Security Council, SDGs, and then what the Ukraine conflict has done to the small vulnerable economies in Africa. My proposition is that India, Japan, if they can get into this area of least developed countries and small island developing economies in terms of aid for climate change, in terms of specifically saying India, Japan is trying to help you against the ill effects of the war in Ukraine. Japan has the money, presumably we have the expertise. Can we do something in some countries? Kenya probably, gets a lot of help from China. So I don't know what we can do in Kenya. But certainly we can do a lot in small island developing economies. And I remember from my time in Paris that they formed a very effective group in the climate change negotiations. Deepa, you would know. I mean, they held up the conference and said, no, we want a reference to 1.5, knowing full well, and now the expert committee from the IPCC has confirmed that, you're already 1.2. So there is no possibility of attaining 1.5. In other words, we will definitely exceed 1.5. But they want that in, because they say our survival is at stake. In terms of why now and where, I have my own interpretation, which may be a little different from the others. One is, I get the feeling that Japan is punching below its weight, and this is one way of, I think, making an attempt to see that they get at least due credit for what they are doing. And certainly they are punching below their weight. Nobody has heard of what Japan is doing in the global south. You can keep saying so many $1 billion. 0.36% of ODA is what I saw, which is not too bad, because Finland and Norway do 0.5, 0.6, but most others don't even do this much. So it's actually commendable, but I don't think they get recognition for it. So this might be. The fact that Kishida did it in Washington is, I think, a clear message for the G6, leaving aside Japan. I think the message is that you guys are arrogant. There is a There is a larger body out there, and you guys are just preaching to them, saying everybody should, vote the way I vote. That's the only way you can interpret it. I also think, frankly, that the Japanese are absolutely convinced that something will happen in Taiwan, and they want to make sure that they get support from the global South when such a thing happens. It could be the South China Sea, it could be Taiwan. I think the Japanese have been a little taken aback by some of the countries not supporting the Russian, or rather not supporting the Western position. But on the other hand, they are thrilled with the UN General Assembly vote of 141 countries. They would like to see that happen if something untoward happens in Taiwan. So Japan, I think, attaches a lot of importance to how the UN General Assembly votes, to the fact that they want to be recognized as a serious person, and so on. So I see these as the reasons. For, I think, India, I go back to G20, but also I think G7, we will be meeting again with the Japanese. I think on the concerns expressed in the Voice of Global South Summit that we had, and it ranges from SDGs, climate change, debt relief, for example. That's a key. If some of you noticed the Bali leaders' declaration, there was a paragraph 33 on debt relief, in which one country dissociated itself. No prizes for guessing which that country was. It was China. So I think Japan, India can do a lot, because almost every country, I understand from MEA in that Voice of Global South Summit, said we are not happy with debt service suspension initiative. We want the principal debt to be forgiven. What the G20 has done is something called debt service suspension initiative, but that's only a suspension of the servicing of debt, not the original debt remains. And these countries know they will never be able to pay back the original debt. China has been taking the line that multilateral development banks should first decide, and after that we will decide. But the fact is, China's loans to the vulnerable countries actually far exceeds that of multilateral development banks now. I didn't know that until recently. It's a much bigger sum now. China is the main creditor now in the world. Not IMF, not ADB, not your Asian Infrastructure Bank. It's China. So that's a big deal. And so we need to get China on board. I believe Japanese-Indian cooperation is critical to getting China on board. At least we isolate them. We try to tell them, listen, there is consensus among others. Can you do something about it? Last time at the Central Bank Governors Conference, the subject was not addressed in full. So there was never an occasion for China to do anything. But China is not going to be alone in doing it unless the rescheduling of debts that we are talking about, that may help them. I have not looked into it very, very carefully. But I think they've rescheduled some of the debts and waived off a few debts. So that is one area, I think, where India, Japan can work together. So I'll stop here, but I do believe if there is, I feel, and this is just a related point, but Deepa, with your permission, in every continent, it is my assessment that the Indian Ministry of External Affairs is picking a key collaborator or a key strategic partner. So in Europe, I dare say it's France, not because I was ambassador there, but genuinely I think France is a strategic partner with whom we have no big issues, frankly, in Europe. I don't think there is any other country with whom we have such a... Similarly, this side, East, Japan. In the Middle East, I dare say it is UAE. So I think there is some thinking. I know you guys don't believe MEA can think, but I think it's not true. As an ex-MEA person, I'd like to see we are full of strategic thinking and we know what we are doing. So I do believe in each continent there is a key country which we have located as our strategic partner. I think it's working okay. In Africa, there is still South Africa. I think Latin America is probably the only region where I cannot say. Brazil, I have very mixed views about Brazil. Raja, this is Chatham House? Otherwise, you'll put me out of business. Okay. No, Brazil, I have a problem because I think we cooperate well, but when push comes to shove in the context of WTO, I don't know what happens in the UN and other, they kind of go with the other side. I've had this experience, Deepa. I don't know if you have had that experience. So I wouldn't say Latin America, but in every other continent, it seems to me we now have partners with whom we are working, like down under Australia. Japan, and I don't know, maybe Indonesia and ASEAN, but you have to look closely because we are trying to, Singapore is, in my view, too small a country, but I don't know what Sanjay Baru you would say. But I do believe there is some logic there in picking partners. And for me, since this is about Japan, I would say that regardless of the bilateral relationship, which I concede is maybe less than ideal, we should do more. But there is, I think, tremendous convergence is what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohan. You can always expect Mohan, to bring some sort of energy into the whole dialogue, and with his openness about what diplomatic practice is really about. So, thank you so much. What I just wanted to mention one thing, this triangular cooperation versus trilateral. I never thought of it, but I think one angle in this whole thing is if it's triangular, it's governments involved more than private sector. If you look at trilateral, it could be it and it need not really be.
I agree.
So I think the triangular part is so if the governments are on the same page and you can get something done. Fine. Now the floor is open for questions, and please do address our panelists. Sure, sir.
Please speak in the mic. Thank you.
Will you take the question?
Yeah, my name is GB Bagai. Look, as a basically bystander to all this, my opinion is that Ukraine would have dissuaded China from attacking Taiwan. And plus, it affects their economy very much. And in fact, instead of any military conflict so far, all their actions have been devoted to economic capture. And if Japan is worried about China doing something to Japan, it might be in terms of revenge for what the Japanese did to China. And plus, I think China is very heavily connected all over the world economically. So the last thing they would want is more sanctions on them. So even in their respect of actions against India, aside from Galwan, they have been non-violent. So I'm trying to say that building military expenditure when we have priorities, welfare priorities for the poor, state of poverty and all, that should get more attention than building up a military. And that applies to Japan also, where they're aging so fast and the youth population is going down. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your comment. Could we have some questions? And you please say who you want to address your questions to. And if it's a comment, do say it's a comment.
Thank you, Chair. It was a very marvelous experience to learn about this relationship, because I'm very interested in Japan. Immediately after my birth, I was there with my father. He was part of British Commonwealth Occupation Forces. And of course, I had trained some Japanese personnel. They had come to Air Force actually to buy air-to-air firing systems. So I was there in Kalaikonda. And that's why. So I'm very interested to know one thing. As we had gathered, and we have been gathering this news, that Shinzo Abe, late Shinzo Abe, Prime Minister, had thought of this process of Asia-Pacific strategic zone, developing into Indo-Pacific zone, and he had propagated that we now must get India into the lead into this, so that India and all the Asia-Pacific countries develop in various fields, co-prosperity sphere in industries and technology and tourism and every aspect, including fighting terrorism, all that. But one thing I want to ask you, that I personally feel, and please tell me whether I'm right or wrong, that Japan has China in view, because China is creating a lot of threat to Japan, violating their airspace regularly, as you know. We don't have to tell you. And India has done a military exercise with Japan very recently, and Japan is back into the Kalaikonda exercise now, which is going on, which is just now going on between India and America. They were observers. So do you think there is a chance of creating an Asia-Pacific union of countries where Japan will fully support, so that a common threat which China has developed, probably that can be nullified? And of course, Quad has come up. That is also looking at China. So militarization of Quad may take place. I do not know. But what I'm trying to tell you, what will be the standing of Japan when this aspect comes in, especially creating a cooperation, a union sort of countries which will not only look after their prosperity, but also a common threat like Japan.
Thank you, sir. I think we will take another 1 or 2 questions. I want some of the young people, yes, please. And I want a nice pointed question. And I find students here also, please. Yes, please go ahead.
I'm Devendra Sahu, Assistant Professor at Jindal School of International Affairs, Jindal Global University. My question is directed to Mr. Sanjaya Baru. Even Professor Rajamohan can touch upon it. You spoke about Kishida building up upon what Shinzo Abe has done. Like Shinzo Abe belonged to the Seiwa Seisaku Kenkyukai, or the popularly known as Abe faction, that is conservative faction, and Kishida belonged to the Kochikai, that is the liberal faction, the pro-Chinese. So I was just wanting to know, like, whether it is Kishida building up upon what Shinzo Abe did, or as you said that he's building upon his shadow. I'm asking whether he's trying to getting into his shadow for domestic compulsion.
Okay. Another, yes, please.
Hi, my name is Purnima. I run a financial services firm called OG. And my question is that, I think one of the things that we see with Japan is it's a very low growth economy. And India is the economy which is the highest growth in the world today. So looking at Japan and the way that it's a privately driven country with companies looking to enter India or expressing interest in coming to India, would pushing this agenda or pushing this kind of investment from Japan to India because they want returns, they know they do have interest in India, would that really help sort of fast pace, or even get like bilateral relationships move forward?
Thank you. Yeah, I think the economic relationship is a very important part of it, and there's a lot happening in that area. There's a lot of focus on both sides. There have been some comments and some questions. So let me just ask Raj to start.
And only one brief thing. I think the idea of a pan-Asian organization, I think that's not there on the cards, I think. Already in a sense, what it is China which is talking about pan-Asianism, saying Asia for Asians, we're all, and the weight in ASEAN and the Pacific Islands has dramatically increased. But what we're seeing from the Japanese side is, one, they constructed the Indo-Pacific. And within that, how do you maximize your impact? One, strengthening the alliance with the US. Second, the Quad. Third, the RAID program, which Sanjay talked about. Fourth, they're working, they offer to give military assistance now, including to Bangladesh. So I think they're taking a series of steps. And what we're seeing is really a series of overlapping institutions, like you have the Quad, you have the AUKUS, you have the Pacific Island Summit, 7 different countries are doing it. So I think it is going to be not a single structure, but a number of structures. One, the Chinese structures, and the Chinese influence on the existing structures like ASEAN, and the counter movement by Japan, backed by its friends and partners. So that's what you're seeing. The era of a single pan-Asian structure, which is what East Asia Summit was supposed to be, all the 16 countries, that era is over. So now you're going to be competing structures. That's the only question I have.
Yeah, let me first respond briefly to Mohan. You see, look, it's not that India-Japan bilateral relationship is not improved. Of course it has improved. There's no question about it. That's not the point I'm making. The point I was making is that bilateral relationship strong enough for us to be able to influence outcomes in other spheres? Or are other spheres shaping this bilateral relation? That's the core issue. Has India-Japan relationship improved because of Quad? Or has Quad been made possible by the reality of a stronger India-Japan relationship? Where does the sequence flow? I think that is at the heart of what I would regard as important, because I have been a strong believer in a foundational relationship between India and Japan. Don't forget, I was in Parliament along with, I'm sure, both of you when Abe spoke. That was a foundational, his architectural view of the relationship, which was not there before that. The relationship was not particularly strong. That's not the subject of today, but I can talk about it. You go back into the past, it was not such a strong relationship. And even today, there is more Japanese investment in China than India. There's more Japanese investment going to Vietnam than coming to India. You know, so you look at the actual reality on the ground, this bilateral relationship, in my judgment, is not as strong as I would like it to be in order for us to be effective, whether in the framework of Quad or in Indo-Pacific or in Africa or wherever. That one, because we are talking about India, Japan as global South. If we want to, you know, operate within the framework of a global South, take on the influence of China, which has huge amount of money, which now has the burden of aid, debt, which has been mentioned, then are we on the same page adequately? That's the real question that I pose. But on this question about Abe and Kishida, I see, look, as the chairperson mentioned, I've just put together a volume on Prime Minister Abe and called The Importance of Shinzo Abe, and having read the contributions of my 15 contributors, I am convinced that Mr. Prime Minister Abe was a turning point in the history of Japan. I personally believe that he has been able to make a series of changes at home, on the economic front, on the political front, in the strategic sphere, and a lot of what is happening today, Prime Minister Kishida is a beneficiary of that. And you know, while the Ukraine may have given him an opportunity to be a little more bold in saying what he's saying, but political foundation for that at home was laid by Abe. Now, whether Mr. Abe himself can come out of that shadow and, you know, have a legacy of his own remains to be seen. As the chairperson reminded us, I think his current popularity ratings are not that high. But, you know, politics is a game of the possible.
Yeah, sure.
Ma'am, can you use the mic, please? Sorry.
We've spoken about in the forum about the regional architecture and security concerns. Is it that the liberal order that has emerged in the Indo-Pacific not keen to use the security as a modus operandi, but use the developmental model as a modus operandi to ensure to get the global South together, and in which I think India, Japan has a role to play. But we've not sufficiently explored, as we've already seen so far. We've not really been very successful in a third country operation, which has also been mentioned in this. If it is the developmental model that we are targeting, and there has been a question, the thing of using the island countries as a mode, is it too little to get a space within the global community when we address only the island countries? Isn't it better to look at a more, countries like, say, Sri Lanka, countries like Vietnam as a location where to start cooperation, rather than island countries, which really becomes pretty insignificant when you look at it from the global perspective?
Thanks, Shabni. I must say that, we ourselves have been courting the small island states hugely, both in the context of climate change and in the context of our aspirations for a role in the UN Security Council and so on. So I think, and now looking at what China is doing in that area, for us to work together, as I mentioned earlier, that I had some experience of being concurrently accredited to the Marshall Islands. And so I think there are opportunities there. At the end of it is one vote in the UN, certainly that, and also in these international conferences on issues to have them. That is, I think it's important for us both in terms of India's own foreign policy, I think, to work with Japan on this. But Mohan will answer the rest of your questions. But submit you, please.
Add one more thing.
Yeah.
The initiative of Blue Dot Economy that was initiated, we have, which showed essentially that to counter China, we cannot do it alone. We need to come together to do it. We haven't made much progress on that end. Also, I would like someone to, address this, and of course, the regional economic architecture, which is, thankfully CTPP, you have UK into it, and which makes a big difference right now. But RCEP isn't. We haven't done it much.
Could I ask Professor Mohan Kumar, and it seems to be an unrelated question, but it disturbs me, so I'm asking it, and I'm curious to know the answer also. The reason is that Rajiv Nath, I'm just a concerned citizen, no official position, nothing. I am told that they are going to be removing all references to American hegemony in political world and the Cold War from history textbooks. And if we have students over here from, let us say, international relations, and if you see one generation hence which has never read about these topics coming into universities, what would it mean? You just wiped out a section of history.
It has been a very productive 1 hour and a heavy download of so many ideas that, I think we need to think through so many things. But one thing, because practicing diplomats and advisors and all of you have served in various positions over decades. So I have two small questions, I would say. One is, what is the policy recommendation that you would give? And so we know that MEA can think, I do believe that, but what are the policy recommendations, if you have to give 3 policy recommendations today for India and Japan to work, how they can work towards the betterment of global South? So if any of you can reflect on that. And also the second question, which of course time and again, I think there is a consensus that Asia-Africa growth corridor has not taken off. And since I think RIS was a institutional partner with IB, JETRO, working out the plans and how to take it forward. So sir, I am not sure whether you were there that time, but I want to know what are your takeaways from that experience, because today if we have to build a future together, we should have a clear lessons of what we have drawn, so that because in recent lecture of Prime Minister Kishida, he's clearly identified South Asia, Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. So even if we talk about, we are toying with the idea of Southeast Asia, but clearly we have not made progress. I mean, whichever theatre you choose, even if it's South Asia, with our experience in Sri Lanka, and everything, domestic politics comes in. I don't know whether co-opting with India is a benefit or it's a liability for them. So from like Asia-Africa growth corridor, what are the lessons that we have drawn? Thank you.
Sure. Mohan. So, thank you. I'm not in any particular order. Sir, on the history books, I am supremely unqualified. I know you addressed the question to me. I have no idea.
My son studied
at Jindal. Oh, okay. No, that's very kind of you, but I have really no idea. Seriously, I mean, I don't pull any punches. If I knew anything, I would have said, but I really have no idea at all. Okay, on I think on RCEP, CPTPP, my sense, I've changed my mind. So full disclosure, I thought that we should join the RCEP. That was my original intention and opinion. But I sat in a meeting where Amul people protested vehemently, and that was a wake-up call for me. I initially thought it was China, and that's the reason why we're not getting into RCEP. But when you have an organization like Amul with a 70-year brand which tells you, listen, we simply can't accept competition, even in the form of milk powder from Australia and New Zealand. For me, that did it. I don't like what I heard, which I told them also. I said, if the 70-year brand can't compete, I said, I drank Swiss milk and I ate Swiss cheese for most of my life because I spent 10 years in Geneva, but I'm perfectly happy with Amul. It's fantastic. So I said, why are you worried? He says, sir, you have no idea. These guys will come, they will come to villages and they will say the milk powder is a lot more hygienic. It's much better than your stupid milk which is brought in an aluminium tin which is full of carcinogenic substance. I mean, they've had a whole thing ready as to why they can't accept it. There are some other reasons which I can't talk about. So anyway, the opinion shifted. I think a strategic decision has been made by the government of India that we cannot compete with countries to the east for two reasons. One, our manufacturing industry is fundamentally uncompetitive. It's not going to become competitive in 3-4 years. Second, the rules of circumvention, and these are rascals of the highest order. I don't want to name countries, but our circumvention rules have been abused. This is a well-known fact. Anybody who knows the implementation of India-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement knows that. There has been massive circumvention. Now, you could argue also as to why we are not able to prevent it, but that will lead me into a different, we don't have the resources, or maybe there are other reasons. But so we have decided to look west. All our FTAs are to the west, which we have now embarked upon. This is the first time. Australia for me is west, although it's down under. Australia nominally belongs to the west. I think our reasoning is that in these areas, two things can work in our favor. Number one, we can continue to export our garments and textiles and other things, because it's quite irrational to expect a shirt made in Luxembourg to be cheaper than India. So that's a safe bet. So you do that. Second, I think they're also agreeable to including services, which ASEAN is not. You just can't do goods with these guys. These guys have gone so far ahead in terms of competitiveness, in terms of their ability to impose non-tariff barriers, which you are not able to impose. So if you want to sell children's clothes, for example, in some of these markets, you cannot do it with any polyester. You have to prove that it is not inflammable. Something which is kind of inconceivable here. You just buy a kind of a garment for your child without thinking about this. You can't sell in the South Korean market. So anyway, there are those issues. I believe, and I'm now not, I don't belong to the government anymore, so my honest opinion is this is a good strategic decision that India has made, because we would have been wiped out by China for various reasons if we had joined the RCEP, unless you have a tremendous plan for doing two things. One, you need tremendous tariff concessions, and the coverage has to be 98%. With Australia, UAE, we are not able to go beyond 70% of the coverage. Second, I really think deep economic reforms are necessary in India. The farm bills, and I don't want to get into political controversy, but the farm bills doesn't inspire much confidence. You've got a strong government. In spite of it, the farm bill is eminently sensible. We couldn't get it through. So I don't know, the reform agenda will play itself out. So for these reasons, I believe we did well in walking out of RCEP. CPTPP is a bridge too far for India. The TRIPS Plus standards, the regulatory obstacles will just... But we are negotiating labor standards, we are negotiating environment with UK and EU. That's a big change. Because until recently, even 5 years ago, we thought these were non-trade issues. Why the hell are we talking about these? But now we know the carbon border tax adjustment is coming, so I think we are negotiating that. On what the single policy recommendation should be, I think it should be Japanese investment in India to make things for the global south. Whether it is vaccines, whether it is mobile phones, whether it is solar panels. Why should you have Chinese solar panels everywhere? So this could be a win-win. India desperately needs investment. But then again, you see, I agree with Sanjaya Baru that Japan invests more in Vietnam and China. But I think partly we should accept that it is our fault also. We need to have an investment regime which attracts investment. Our model bilateral investment treaty, there are no takers. So we are negotiating an investment treaty with EU. Hopefully that will be world class, and then we can kind of MFN based approach so that we make it available to others. My last point on Japan, all these other countries to the east of India sit on the fence. They'll pay lip service to China, but they have a beautiful way of solving things, which is outsource your security to United States and Europe and make love and make trade with China. They'll continue to sit on the fence. In my mind, the only country which is not sitting on the fence is Japan. It has actually put its relationship with China on the line. That is the only country which can do it. South Korea, for example, will not do it. My repeated trips to South Korea, they are very clear. They say this is terrible what's going on, this US-China, because we have invested so much in electric batteries and other things. They don't like the Inflation Reduction Act, for example. So the only country which can actually, even more than India at times, I get this feeling, Japan can take on China. And I think that is why I see a meeting of mind, a strategic convergence, if you like, between India and Japan. Sorry, Deepa.
Not at all. Thank you. I think that's a very good note to end on. I mean, he's given us a very practical reasons, and I think this also underscores really what Dr. Sanjaya Baru was saying of the importance of bilateralism versus all these, what is it, plurilateral, minilateral, various names that we've come up with. But I really do agree. I think we have to strengthen that economic relationship. The political security relationship is going quite well, but this is the area that is of importance to us. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you have had some takeaways from here, and we're happy to have a full house with all of you here. Thank you very much.